Well, thank you, Jeffrey. Thanks to all of you for coming. I think it's fair to say that if there are two challenges in the world that deserve our attention, first is probably climate change, and the second, in a very different way, of course, is China. And you may wonder how it is that those of us who do China have ended up putting a visual show on about the melting glaciers of the Himalayas. And I hope those of you who haven't seen the show downstairs will do so. It's an attempt, as Jeffrey said, to sort of depict this problem visually rather than just didactically through a spoken word. And of course, as you all know, China is the largest carbon emitter and the largest burner of coal in the world, even though they're also doing rather incredible things in terms of renewable energy. But nonetheless, their carbon emissions keep rising. And the United States is number two, second largest carbon emitter, but the largest per capita and the largest historical emitter of carbon. So here we have two countries that demonstrably don't know how to get along. And we have the challenge of all challenges, climate change. And we have John Kerry, who was our climate negotiator, appointed by President Biden, just stepped down, I think, after having a very frustrating interlude. So we thought it'd be good to rally these three from the New York Times. Jesse, who's an editor, told me there's 13 climate reporters.
Reporters, about 13 or so.
Yeah.
We're a desk of almost 20 people.
So it's pretty big. But I thought it'd be interesting for us to just hear their thoughts about their labors, how they think they're doing, what are the impediments, and how they're looking at this question, and where are they getting through it all. But first, let's start this way. I'd like to ask each of you, how did you first get inoculated with this issue? What was the first thing that, I mean, did you just, your editor just say, hey, Ray, come on down, you're climate, or how did this happen? Let's start with you, Ray.
I have been on the desk less time than these two, less than many people on the desk, so What
did you do before?
I was a reporter covering China. I was based in Taiwan during the pandemic, covering business, technology, the pandemic, Taiwan increasingly, but also China as well. And I had worked with Jesse in India years before, and so it was sort of through Jesse that I came onto the climate desk. It was not a particularly gloriously thought through effort, but I did happen to be in Taiwan during a terrible, once-in-a-generation drought there, and I did see even a country that is, well, Taiwan, an island that is now known for being advanced in technology and semiconductors. Drought affects the semiconductor industry as well. So I did have an early taste of climate reporting.
And usually drenched in rain.
One of the wettest places on Earth, but also once in a while.
Yeah.
Very dry.
So you will see downstairs in the museum the consequences, which are drought, fires, hurricanes, typhoons, and many other untoward climate events. Jesse, what about you? What's your odyssey into this?
So first on Ray. So Ray had to, for reasons, move back to the U.S. basically. And
you say reasons. That's reasons, rather
yes.
Enigmatic.
There are reasons for him wanting to do that. And I heard about this and was like, we need to hire Ray. And so that's how he ended up on the climate. Essentially how he ended up on the climate desk, because we were, like he said, we worked together in India. And I mean, he's just super smart. And so I told my boss, please hire Ray, and she did. So, so my little path to climate coverage is meandering. I used to be at the Wall Street Journal, and was actually the editor of the journals. The journal had a climate reporter who's focused on climate. This is back 12, 13, 15 years ago. Jeff Ball, he's fantastic writer. So that was my first sort of really tangential immersion in some of the issues. This was back in the hockey stick days, right? This is the issue one of the issues that he was writing about. This is how long ago it was. And then I ended up sort of hopping around to various jobs around the world. I was in India for a while and so forth. And then at the New York Times, I became, in a different era, before there was a climate desk, I became the person who did climate, among other things, I worked on climate change coverage on the business desk, okay? And so then when our group was formed, I kind of knew the folks who were covering climate around the newsroom, and I was asked to join the formal desk, and that's how I ended up here. So kind of meandering and hopping around a little bit.
Thank you, and thank you all for turning up to listen to a bunch of journalists. So I was South Asia Bureau Chief in 2007 or 8 when I went up to one of the glaciers in the Indian Himalayas with a glacier scientist who at the time was measuring how quickly that particular glacier was receding. It was one of the many instances where I was seeing in the world the consequences of climate change at a time when not many people were talking about it as a central global issue. I went to Bangladesh to write about, islands. They're called chars. They're islands in the delta that were kind of vanishing and new ones forming, and it's a natural process, but it had been accelerated by sea level rise. And various other ways in which I was seeing the impact of climate change, both in South Asia. Before that, I was the West Africa Bureau Chief. I went to Darfur when that conflict started. And one of the kind of aggravating factors of that conflict was said to be a long period of drought in that area. Not quite a cause and effect thing, but certainly in the background. And so I was seeing it in the world, and I had also been covering like war and peace and diplomacy. And so when this team started up, I was just coming out of Syria, actually. I was covering the conflict in Syria. There was it is said to be one of the threat multipliers in that conflict. So it felt really like a natural progression in my work to understand the global impact of climate change. And so in 2018-ish, I think I joined the desk. So I've been at it for, now it feels like, for a while. Yeah, 5 years.
Are you frustrated with the challenges of trying to make people wake up to the question of climate change?
I wouldn't say I'm frustrated. As journalists, we bear witness to often human suffering. I've spent, much of my career writing about humanitarian crises. I've reported from 10 conflict zones. And so that is part of the work that I do, is to witness what is happening in the world and attempts to change it. So that is what I continue to do as a climate reporter.
And Ray, how do you think you're doing in terms of keeping the public informed? Do you think you're getting through?
I think it's hard to know. I think, unfortunately, we have very primitive tools for understanding our audience. We try. I think we're trying to figure out new ways, but it's always hard to it's always hard to understand what readers are responding to. It's easy to understand why a big, frightening story gets views. It's less easy to gauge whether sort of a more subtle story about a solution or about, you know, opening the imagination to another way of doing things is reaching people. It's hard to know, I think. I think just in terms of, as Somini said, I try to be humble about what it is I could even hope to do. I don't think it's necessarily my job, or it should be any journalist's job, to sort of enact change ourselves. I think we want to be humble about what our powers actually enable us to do.
When you're assigning stories, Jesse, what's on your mind? What do you? I mean, I think there's a lot of people feel that more bad news is not very edifying. People don't want to hear it. They don't want to read it. How do you thread that needle?
You know, I'm going to be the back to your previous question for just a moment. I'm going to be the optimist.
Please.
And it's actually, it can be extremely gratifying to see how widely read and shared and embraced some of the stories that we do write can be. You know, these stories that, on the face of it, are warning, perhaps depressing, sad, not happy stories, right? And yet they can not only find an audience, but surprise people, inform them, and even on occasion, I'm going to use an unexpected word perhaps, but even sort of entertain people. It's not quite the right word, but delight people in a surprising way. I'm thinking of a particular story that Somini did about the fungus, about the mushroom guy, right?
Yeah.
But we also, I'll just give a couple examples. We did this really extraordinary, elaborate piece about the dangers that the city of Chicago faces from climate change. Now that's not a happy story, right? That's a warning. It's a story of it's a warning. It's a story about warning Chicago that you have problems. And that story was just extremely widely read. And not only that, but we heard from so many people in Chicago who said, I just had no idea. I live in Chicago. I've lived here for my whole life.
So tell us quickly, what are the problems Chicago faces?
Okay, so Chicago faces a complicated problem that you sort of wouldn't expect, and it's very particular to Chicago. But Chicago is built, as we all know, on Lake Michigan, but it's actually built in this very, very low spot. It's almost like it's built on what you might call a continental divide between Lake Michigan on one side and the Mississippi River Basin to the west, right? And the reason the city was built there was because this low spot was essentially a marsh, and 150 years ago, trappers this was the easiest place for people to move a canoe or a raft or a boat from one part of the country to the other. That's literally why Chicago exists where it is. So fast forward to today, and with climate change causing various extreme swings of all sorts, the level of the lake rises and falls much more than it has risen and fallen traditionally. And that's a threat to Chicago because it's in this very, very low space, very low spot. Anyway, one of the most important cities in America, in the world, and it's got this crazy, perhaps unsolvable problem.
I mean, our job as journalists is to inform the public about what we all should know to be, well-informed citizens of our countries. So much of the time, it's to tell stories about the world as it is and to point out, those who are creating the problems. Oftentimes, and to explain in hopefully simple, easy to understand ways complicated problems. So most of the time we are telling stories about the world as it is, oftentimes that also means telling stories of people who are trying to create change. That's just part of, bread and butter of journalism. I particularly like telling stories about people. So, my journalism has largely been about the consequences, the human consequences of climate hazards, especially on the most vulnerable people in the world, who happen to be the world's poor.
So how do you three analyze the challenge of getting through to climate deniers? Do you worry about that? Do you think about that? Do you cover them? Have you done stories on what's in their head?
We have occasionally written about, yes is the short answer. Our approach to writing about climate, I think climate change could be, with respect to the denier phenomenon, is this. In a nutshell, we don't both sides the story. The science of climate change is well established and undeniable, essentially. And so we don't flirt with the sort of both sidesism here. As part of that, I'd say we are very careful to when we do have occasion to write about deniers or denialism. An important part of the story is to get beyond just the fact of that denialism and sort of examine why it's happening, what's driving it, what's behind it, what are the motivating forces, perhaps, the influences.
And what do you think is behind it? I mean, I'd like to ask all three of you that question. I mean, because it seems fairly self-evident there's a problem, right?
There are many, I would say there are a lot of forces behind it. One is a really simple, basic human emotion, which is change is scary. And climate change is a slow-moving force in terms of the human, the human lifetime, the human experience, human lifespan. And some of the changes that would be required to address it might seem to some people to be faster or dangerous or risky, or expensive. That's one force, but there are any number of others too.
Two things.
The fossil fuel industry and its incentives to slow change, for instance, but many other powerful forces.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think when you look at the public opinion survey data in the United States, where the power of climate denial lists seems to be higher than in many other countries, even in the United States, it's a pretty small percentage of the population that in survey after survey absolutely deny climate science. In fact, the vast majority of Americans actually accept not only the science of climate change, but also want their government resources to go into renewable energy technologies and the rest of it. So I think it's important to realize that we're talking about a pretty small but vocal minority. I think it's also important to realize that doubt in the science has been weaponized, and there's a lot of money behind that kind of weaponizing machine. And as Jesse has pointed out, I think some of our most powerful stories have been, who's behind this?
Yeah.
And I think that's public service. We want our audience, I want to know who's behind this. And I think that's important to cover.
I'll just say, I think I used to, when I first started this job, think more about the nasty emails from deniers I would get writing about these things. But of late, I think I actually think about it only in the sense that I know that what I write could be twisted, especially because I write about science and research and scientists. And I think one of the sort of a lot of the drama of science is that there's things we don't know and that people are trying to find out, but there still remains constantly things they still don't know, and sort of improvement in knowledge is the story. But if you say in a story in your coverage that scientists aren't sure about this, or scientists still are looking for answers to this, that's sort of, I feel like I need to be conscious about how those kinds of statements, because if you're a scientist, you understand why that is. But if you're someone who comes at it with bad faith, you can very easily twist that. So I think actually I do think about them, but maybe not, maybe in that slightly second order way.
But in truth, don't you think it's fair to say that by and large, scientists have been overly cautious in underrepresenting the consequences rather than excessively alarmist?
I think yes and no, maybe. I think scientists generally were more pessimistic 10 years ago about the progress that has been made on transitioning energy supplies and transitioning the economy. But maybe they were excessively optimistic 10 years ago about the effects of the warming that we are seeing. So I think it's a little bit, it's a mixed bag. I think scientists they are generally cautious, and I think for good reason. I think they are in a position where a degree of caution and sort of that it's inbuilt and it's natural. And I think it's actually my job or our job to clarify the message that they're cautious for this reason, but maybe you should be thinking differently for another reason. Sort of, we have to bridge the gap between scientists and the public.
Well, we can admire their caution at the same time that recognize that they have, it seems to me anyway, that by and large they have, temperature elevations have proceeded more rapidly than models had suggested. I mean, so fair enough. But that actually should work to make scientists more credible. Now, if we look at this problem, I'm wondering what you all think about. I mean, if we turn to solutions for a minute, we have business, we have government, we have policymakers, science. How do you all look at the sort of major sort of factors that might solve this problem, might be able to remedy it? Is business more important than government? Government more important than business? What do you think?
Wow,
Take it away.
Yeah, that's an easy one.
Is it?
I mean, the fact is, the changes that the changes that need to happen. Essentially, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. I mean, that's it. You can say it. You can state it in a sentence.
Yeah.
You need to stop burning fossil fuels. That is a gargantuan change. That's a change to the entire modern global economy, because energy is the thing that is the energy that we know about, that we experience as human beings in our own lives right here in the early 21st century. That energy is the thing that created the economy and the global economy that we live in and know and experience. So that's a big change. So how do you change that? That's that's probably something that needs to change at a policy level, so maybe that's where I would land on that. It's a policy. It's government. It's sort of government.
Government has to set the policies, and then business will follow.
Right.
But sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Somini, you look like you have a thought.
I mean, I have only two thoughts, and they're obvious, I think. First, I will push back a little bit against the word solutions. I would submit that climate solutions is a little bit imprecise. We're not solving climate change. It is a process that is underway, very much underway. There's warming baked in because of the, no pun intended, because of the emissions of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. However, there are lots of changes that can be made, both to rapidly reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases and to adapt to the impacts of that kind of climate change. And as Katharine Hayhoe, who's a terrific science communicator, puts it, there is not one, what did she say? There's not
Silver
one
bullet,
silver
buckshot.
bullet. There are many silver buckshots. And those buckshots are being tried out in every sector throughout the world. And the last thing that I will say is something that was very memorable to me when I went to Malawi to write a story about smallholder farmers and what kinds of changes they were seeing in their fields and how they were changing their farming practices. I remember asking a woman who trains farmers to try, different kinds of things. I asked her, so, what do you do? Sometimes I am asked by people in the United States, faced with a problem of this magnitude, what do we do? And she said to me very simply, she sort of looked at me and she said, Somini, you do everything because you have to. It's not a choice. So I think that people, particularly who are the world's poorest, they're compelled to do everything. Perhaps we have the luxury in the rich world to wonder, what do I do?
You mentioned Katharine Hayhoe, and if I'm correct, isn't she at Texas A&M, and her father is an evangelical Christian?
Her husband is a evangelical pastor.
And wasn't there a film made about, I thought it was the father, but about she agreed, and he agreed, that she could bring anybody in the United States from the science community to talk to, like whether it was her husband, and to see if they could convince him to believe that climate change was a problem. Did you see this film?
I did not.
Well,
I don't think that's Katharine Hayhoe. I don't know.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound
is she
like
at Texas
Katharine
A&M?
Texas Tech. She is
Texas Tech.
Tech.
It is her. And the result was that after a year of bringing all these pilgrims up to speak with the father about the vicissitudes of climate change and how it worked, and he was a rational, reasonable man, agreed to do it, he still came out on the side of being a climate denier.
Upbeat film.
Yeah.
Yeah, upbeat film. Yeah, probably not people lined up around the block trying to get in to see it. Ray, I wonder from your perspective, when you've been out in Asia and in Taiwan and looking at China, do you think there's any hope that the U.S. and China will find a way to come together on this issue?
I think there is, yes, in short. I think it's the technology at the moment, unfortunately, and the sort of material realm and cooperation in terms of supply chains and manufacturing, that's actually really, seems actually harder. I think the common endpoint of, seeking some kind of diplomacy at a high level is there, but ultimately what that can actually mean if these countries are reluctant to trade with each other freely, if there's sort of, if political conflicts between the U.S. and China turn into economic sort of barricades being thrown up, that's a big impediment. Because it seems like, at least for the moment, both countries' leaderships do want to get somewhere on this, if nothing else.
Yet they've not.
And they've not.
And why do you think that is?
I think Somini could probably speak more to what happens at COP when these two countries...
Somini, speak.
Look, when the U.S. pulled out of, let's just back up for a second, right? The Paris Agreement finally was struck because at the very highest levels, of the U.S. and Chinese government, there was an agreement that it would take this kind of shape, right? So that happens between the U.S. and China, an agreement, a very high-level agreement. Both countries take seriously that this is a threat to their economies, to their national securities, to their agriculture, to their cities. There's a base-level agreement. Then they are able to sign up every other country, and we get the Paris Agreement. Donald Trump pulls the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. One of many, by the way, kind of vicissitudes of U.S. climate policy over the last 20 years. Not the only one, but a very serious one. Interestingly enough, China does not respond by pulling out of the climate agreement. It stays in. The U.S. comes back in 4 years later. By this time, it is very clear that China has been retooling its economy and has come to dominate solar, wind, battery production, and the securing of critical minerals and the processing of that. The success of the passage of the big piece of climate legislation in the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act, is in part driven by that recognition. And you have now the United States putting quite a bit of money into growing the green economy.
Or reshoring supply chains in the green tech.
Well, building battery factories, rolling out EV charging stations, rolling out solar and wind, while at the same time growing its gas industry, and while at the same time China is massively growing coal. But what you are seeing is both the United States and China putting resources into growing the green economy. You're seeing also signs of protectionism in the United States, against some Chinese imports. That is now been kind of reciprocated in Europe. The European Union has a very big, well-resourced plan, a law to shift its economy away from fossil fuels and into the green economy. So I would not agree that nothing is happening. I think there's a lot happening, and it's happening as we speak, in transforming the energy system, in transforming transportation, the sale of electric vehicles, cars, motorcycles, two-wheelers. The expansion of electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers is a really underappreciated phenomenon.
Not if you walk the streets of New York. Where you get hit by one every other block.
See. Well, but I think if you are in much of Asia, where this is the way people get around, electrifying two-wheelers and three-wheelers is hugely, hugely important. Because before they used to run on diesel, which is extremely dirty.
Or two-stroke engines.
So the next sector that has been, I think, slowest to change has been agriculture. Extremely, hugely impacted by climate change, but also a real source of emissions, a huge source of emissions. That is going to be the next big battleground, I think, in my view, because it's very difficult to change food systems. Arguably, it's more difficult to change the way we grow food than the way we, get around.
Let me ask you all, how many of you have an electric car? Raise your hands. Wow.
Well, this is New York, so you might also say
Yeah.
who
How many of you have
How many of you have cars? This to me, as somebody who's driven an electric car for over a decade, I have to say, I just can't understand why everybody doesn't have an electric car. I mean, I understand, but I don't understand. And so here we are. Now, Tesla has been dethroned, and China is about to take over the EV market, and there's going to be a lot of protectionism going on. So how do you all look at that great struggle? Should we be buying solar panels from China that are made out of polysilicon from Xinjiang, and many of the panels made there? Should we be buying, XPeng and BYD automobiles from China? How do you three assess that standoff if you think there's a possibility of conflict? Do we want to have a lot of Chinese cars on the road that could be stopped in their tracks? Because I know Elon Musk talks to my Tesla. I hear it when I go out at night. They're communicating. And it is true that your car could be stopped in its tracks by whoever. How do you all feel about that?
So I'll jump in on that one, because I think there's an important part of the question that you're asking that we have to just address head on, and that is that it's not really for us to decide whether Americans should be buying X product from
You
other
as
countries.
journalists.
Right.
Yes,
I mean,
that's right.
that's kind of not the assignment, so to speak.
Yeah.
No, but there is a story there.
It's certainly, there absolutely is, and it is certainly an interesting question. Just to back up, and I'm not dodging the question, but just to back up for thought, because of something, when we were talking earlier, you asked your earlier question about what is the thing that needs to change? Is it industry? Is it policy? Is it what is it? Is it us as individuals doing something? And the stuff that you were just talking about, and the Somini was just talking about, gets right at that. Oh, and also the question about China and what what motivates China, and all of the stuff that all three of you were talking about there for a few minutes gets right at one of the things that does motivate China or any nation to act, and that is an interest in being a leader in next generation technology. And that's one of the really fundamental conflicts that any number of countries in the world, China and the United States included, have to balance. We want to be leaders in this next generation technology. It will be an advantage to us because we will be able to sell stuff to the rest of the world, and we'll be able to employ our citizens in good paying jobs and get reelected, all the things, right, that might motivate a country to have that kind of policy. And yet at the same time, you have any number of, conflicting pressures on the other side to move more slowly, whether it's pressure because difficulty to change your industrial structure too quickly, or a need to create jobs now, not 10 years from now. Otherwise, your citizens might be displeased with you. So these are, literally the complications in oversimplified form that a place like China has to, or any nation has to, really wrestle with.
I mean, our job is to explain the world and to tell stories, right? That will inform you, that will delight you occasionally, that will make you think, that will change your mind. So one of the great stories that we are following, we have been following, is the way in which a climate-changed world might affect this great geopolitical story of our time, which is relations between U.S. and China. So these two storylines have a lot to do with each other, right? Can't really tell the story of U.S.-China dynamics without talking about the energy transition. And you can't talk about the energy transition and climate change without also really thinking about the great story of our time, which is the rise of China and U.S.-China relations.
So, Ray, let me throw you this question. One would have thought that a pandemic would have brought the two countries together, but it didn't. And one might think that climate change would be a logical field of common interest that would bring us together. And yet.
can I just say on the last question, I think just as a sort of cybersecurity minded person, I find it sort of a shame that the low emissions vehicle development and boom has coincided with digitization and everything moving to the internet and making everything vulnerable to cybersecurity issues. We could have imagined a different future in which low emissions vehicles were basically just dumb golf carts and didn't have to be connected to the internet, right? And so you could sort of start to separate these two concerns, right? You could say U.S. China hacking and cybersecurity and sort of meddling at that level could be a different issue from the climate one. Unfortunately, that's sort of not how things have gone.
So let me ask you a question, a very practical question. Would you buy a BYD?
I don't intend to own any car for a while in my life, I'd say.
That's
I'm
an
sorry to
artful
dodge the
dodge.
question.
But if you were going to buy a car,
He's gonna.
I think as I do to my phone, having been a reporter in China, you learn to
yeah.
insulate your life and your devices. I don't know enough about how EV interfaces are these days, but if there's a way to safeguard yourself, I would take it.
I'm sure there is, but normal mortals probably wouldn't know how to do it. I mean, this is a really interesting question, isn't it? That we lived in a completely globalized world for so long, when it was a win-win-win. Everybody thought didn't matter. We just all get together and make it where you can, get it cheap, fast, and no low inventories. And now suddenly, because of politics, it seems to me it's profoundly affected the tech question, which affects the climate change remedy question, because we're now starting to balkanize tech, and to sort of have, just different economies and different. And I wonder how you all react to that in terms of what will the effects be on our ability to handle a question like climate change. And you sounds like you've been in tech, covering tech. What are your thoughts?
I think it would be, it would be naive to imagine that these vulnerabilities are sort of, that they are real vulnerabilities. And I think there is we've cybersecurity breaches and incidents happen all the time. There's a sort of well-documented state capacity increase around the world by many advanced nations, even not particularly advanced nations, in doing this. This is the new arena in which these kinds of conflicts can play out. So the balkanization takes different forms. Does TikTok need to be part of that balkanization? I don't know. It's a tricky one. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to hard infrastructure, people, we know the vulnerabilities in dams, in electricity systems now, to cybersecurity problems. This is, somebody getting access to your photos on your phone is one thing, but sort of mass shutdowns of power and water systems is, I would say that's a real concern. So,
I also I just want to come back to the car question. I don't think it's a given that everyone has to drive a car. And I think the climate crisis is bringing us closer to that reckoning. And in many places, in many cities around the world that, I don't know, for the last maybe 40, 50 years, not much more than that, where cars were allowed everywhere, I think there is really questions being asked, a scrutiny on, well, should we turn over this much public space to cars? That question has been raised because of two things, air pollution and emissions from cars.
Yes, I think fair enough. I mean, there are big changes, and yet it seems to me that the solution to this problem, which is in fact a kind of quintessentially global problem, because whoever admits, it doesn't matter, we all will suffer the consequences, right? And so it seems to me that the solution, therefore, also is probably going to be impossible to find one if it isn't of a global nature in the very world that is sort of deglobalizing now. And I think the U.S. and China are the sort of archetypical examples of decoupling. And I wonder if you all view that in such a world we can realistically expect to solve this.
The UNFCCC has not balkanized quite yet. The IPCC process is still sort of very global, participation by nearly every nation. It's I think sort of the most global diplomatic infrastructure for climate is pretty robust still.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a hypothetical question problem to your question. The global, to state the obvious, the global economy is deeply, deeply, deeply intertwined. And even though, and the car example is an interesting example. I mean, China wants to dominate the electric car, the electric vehicle and the battery market. Full stop, it does. It's was ahead of the rest of the world with respect to its thinking in that regard. But nevertheless, it is such it's also a kind of a unique example, and I don't want to say that the car, it's a small example because the auto industry is one of the most important industries in the world. Nevertheless, it is unique in certain ways there, right? But also, I would say, back to your basic question, would you buy a Chinese-made car? Would I buy a Chinese-made car? I live in New York City, right? Okay. But I happen to have been helping my mom think about buying her next car recently. And so we have a study sample size of one, my mom. And what she was interested in is how far will I be able to drive, and is it safe? Is it a safe car? And I would say that right now, on the second point, the Chinese automobiles, the Chinese-made automobiles are really failing. They're not safe. Perhaps that would be fixed in a few years, in 5 or 7 years or 4 years. I'm sorry?
They're cheap.
They're certainly cheap, but that wasn't her question. Her question was safe, right? Yeah. So what point am I making? I'm not entirely sure, but I think that a normal person might not be thinking about whether my car will be hacked by bad guys in Shanghai for some reason, but is it safe? Can I get to the airport and back? These kinds of more fundamental questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to Ray's point, I mean, the threats to our privacy from, our entirely connected world is something that we are constantly making daily choices on.
Yes. But sometimes I feel we are ill-equipped to make the right decisions. And that's where you guys come in to keep us well informed. Before we open it up to questions from you all, let me just ask each of you, what's the story that you would really like to do that you haven't done or haven't been able to do? And in Jesse's case, what's the one you really would like to assign that you haven't yet? Let's start with you, Ray, on this area.
I think and the Times has great resources to do this, and I think there's so much opportunity to expand people's imaginations about what a different world could look like. I think there's a great deal of pessimism and forgetting about what humankind has achieved in the past. And I think journalism is, as Somini says, often about the world as it is, but it can be also about helping people imagine a different world. And I think I talk often about this piece that the opinion pages did. Farhad Manjoo, one of our columnists in the opinion pages, did an incredible visual story exploration of what New York City, of what Manhattan would look like if it didn't have all that space dedicated to cars. Not just roads, but parking spaces, the sort of square, just seeing what the city and sort of how much of the city, the footprint of the city is devoted to cars, and sort of what that would look like to be used differently. That's sort of expanding your imagination, that you can sort of walk around New York and see it in a different light. And I think there's that kind of thing that can be done in other areas.
Well, downstairs on the 3rd floor, you will see a room of what New York could look like in 2050 when temperatures are elevated 20 or 30 degrees if we did it right. And that's a big if. Jesse, what's the story you're yearning to launch?
Well, I am not going to tell you because there might be journalists in the crowd. I know there's at least one. Here's one story that I think that I would read, and it would have to be sort of a magazine-y approach, or it's not a news story. It's not a breaking news story, but and I have thought about this a little bit and just thought about how we might possibly do something like this someday. And this gets back around to the notion of change is scary, right? And look at all this stuff that you guys, all you climate people want to change. That would be the mindset from a certain person who is resistant to doing some of the things that all those scientists say we need to do, and whatever. A piece with some kind of historical sweep that reminds us and shows us all of the extraordinary ways that the world has radically changed in the past 100 years, or even the past 70 years, or some remarkably short period of time from our point of view. And to come back to New York City, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, your problem walking around New York City was not electric scooters, it was horse poop. Yeah. In astonishing volumes. So, what a change, right? I don't know, I just think that there could be some really, and I'm going to use the word entertaining again, but some kind of really entertaining, surprising piece that really got inside the kinds of changes that we have seen in the way we live our lives, in the way the world works, in the global economy, in our societies, our expectations.
Largely attributable to
fossil
technological
fuels.
changes.
Fossil fuels. Yeah.
Fossil fuels. Somini?
Well, I have good news and bad news for Jesse. There's a great book, new book.
Somebody did it.
Called, what is it? Not the End of the World or something? By Hannah Ritchie, which really does document the great progress that our species has made. Not to gloss over the problems that we've created, which your exhibition documents, but also the great progress that has been made, just to kind of remind us, that change is sort of the only constant. Change is constantly. We are capable of that as a species. I think the only kind of story that no, let me start again. You asked what kind of a story do I want to write that I haven't written yet, right?
Yeah.
So what I'd really like to write are stories that would be useful for all of us, for all of you. Useful, not just, I got a scoop, or this is really unexpected and counterintuitive and surprising. Those are all great, metrics for the kinds of stories that we like to write. But I would like to be useful to my readers on this particular subject in this profoundly transformative moment. I'm not sure that I have been as much as I would like.
Okay, so just to close out, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being pessimistic and 10 being optimistic, where would you each put yourselves in terms of our ability, of humankind's ability to listen to your sage writings and come to their senses and do something, right?
I'm probably a 7 or an 8.
That's pretty good.
Oh, I don't think it was. I guess I think it's not to say it will be painless and that there won't be great suffering in the process, but I think injustice and the most vulnerable will continue to bear the greatest burdens. But I think I'm generally hopeful. I think generally, just thinking about Jesse's point about progress, people are saying, how are we going to plug in all these EVs? The electricity grid won't handle it. I mean, they said that 30 years ago about the phone lines and the internet. How is the phone network going to accommodate this internet thing? Look at where we are, so.
Well, in California, every new house has to have a solar collector on the roof, so there's one answer. Jesse, where are you on the Richter scale of pessimism and optimism?
I'm somewhere north of the midpoint for sure. Are global temperatures going to go back to where they were in 1920? Average global temperatures going to go back to the place they were in 1920? Pick your year. I think that. I mean, I'm just speculating. But I think that's unlikely. That would require doing things like taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, right? At a mammoth scale. So this is that's a roundabout way of making a simple point. I think the climate has changed and it will remain changed. But where is my optimism? I think my optimism, if I'm going to be in like the 6 or 7 or 7.34, I don't know. My optimism that I'm trying to express is that I think people will do something to slow down the process.
And we do know what to do.
It's astonishingly simple when you express it in one sentence. Stop burning fossil fuels. The devil's in the details, but yeah.
Somini?
Yeah, I don't know that I have that scale in my brain, to tell you the honest truth. I think if there are problems, we have solved problems in the past.
Yeah. But we've had some pretty bad train wrecks, too.
And there have been bad train wrecks. But, this is not our first rodeo, right? So if there are problems, there are people who can solve those problems.
Well, I'm heartened by your cheery relative optimism.
Never been called cheery.
Yeah, cheery is not the word.
No, but it's great that you all, who are deep in the weeds on this, have not despaired. So thank you. All right, let's have a few questions from you all. Raise your hands. Yes.
I read somewhere that in Utah there is water being used to make lithium batteries, and they're going to run out of water. It seems that every solution has a downside.
Yeah, so she's saying that every solution has a downside. That making lithium batteries, and there's some process in Utah that uses a lot of water, and one could say the same about microchips in Arizona or everything. Every problem creates another problem. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, I hear there's a lithium prospect in the Salton Sea in California.
I would just say one thing on that, and it's kind of a truism, so apologies, but there is no perfect solution. There's no perfect in life or in anything, right? Not just in climate change. There are trade-offs that one must make, one of the richest examples in the climate change realm is the notion that if we're going to convert if we're going to move toward greener sources of energy and batteries and this sort of thing, we've got to do a whole lot more mining, right? Have to dig up a whole lot more stuff, and that has environmental costs and consequences. Well, of course, continuing to drill for oil has environmental consequences. So there's not some third option or some other option that magically eliminates all of that digging into the earth with shovels that's going to be required to make those batteries that we need. So, not a satisfying answer, but I think that's kind of what the problem is. There's no perfect fix for stuff.
Yeah, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Other questions? Yes, right here. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much. As a young person, we all look up to the work that you guys have done, so thank you. All three of you have spent time working in India, and we've spoken a lot about the U.S. and China, but I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit towards, India's role in this conversation and how it's changed since you've been on the ground reporting there.
Yeah, well, two of you who've been there, or three of you.
Yeah, all three of us.
Yeah.
Somini, once you...
Yeah, I mean, India faces, I think, a profound test, which is how to continue to grow its economy and reduce poverty in a very, very, very young country, while if it can do that in a low-carbon way. And, arguably no country has faced that test at the scale of India. I think India's demographics are both an asset and a liability. India is the youngest country in the world, in the sense that it has the largest cohort of people under the age of 40 than any other country in any time in human history. I wrote a book about that, about young people in India. They can be innovators and agents of change, and they can also the challenge is how to create opportunities, how to create economic opportunities, housing, food, jobs, energy. So I think India is a really, really crucial piece in this puzzle, and is also one of the countries that continues to grow its coal fleet, but is also growing its solar in particular, less so wind, but is also really growing its solar potential.
There was a question in the back here.
Yeah, hi. Has there been reporting in the Times about cooperation among people in the U.S. and China on this issue and others? So, students groups or artists or scientists, maybe climate activists. And I ask because much of the reporting, becomes about the geopolitical competition, which is real, and, among the sort of, with semiconductors and so on. But I'm wondering if at the level of mass cooperation between the peoples who, have the shared interest in preserving the planet, is there reporting on that kind of, cooperation, if it exists?
I don't think we've done very much on it. I think I don't claim to know what's actually going on. It's a very good point. I will just say foreign non-Chinese NGOs in China are in a very legally precarious position more and more. It's not easy for civil society for that kind of cooperation to exist. So it is unfortunately complicated by geopolitics as well. It's not outside that realm, but I think it is. It could be interesting, so thank you.
I mean, I think that's sort of the message in general, isn't it? That geopolitics is complicating solutions to global problems, whatever they may be.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you know of an example, if there's a particular thing you have in mind that you know that is occurring, there are some reporters on the stage who would be interested to hear about it.
I teach at a large public university, and we couldn't survive without students from China. There's a lot of Americans now with adopted Chinese children. I mean, it's a huge social change that's unprecedented in the history of both China and the U.S. So it just seems like there's this mass, basis for people to recognize the shared interests, whatever their governments are doing.
Yeah. I mean, you would think, and I think you're absolutely right, but alas, that has not come to pass.
I do think that there is scientific exchange, and I had heard from a glacier scientist a little while ago who was deeply worried about the impact of geopolitical tensions on his ability to cooperate with his Chinese research partners. But there is, robust scientific exchange, and it was pointed out to me that even during the worst years of the Cold War, there were ways for U.S. and Russian scientists to talk to each other and cooperate, and that is extremely important.
In fact, I think there is some interesting research going on as to how the U.S. related to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, both in terms of scientific exchange, but also nuclear weapons treaties, Helsinki Accords, all kinds of things that actually did happen, which are not happening with China now. And I think there's some instructions there. Okay, let's maybe have one question right here.
Thanks for doing this, you guys. You have a really interesting discussion. How do you think about, as you pick the stories you want to do, and as you think about broadly the coverage that you want to take on, we're in an energy transition here. We're in a place where solutions are beginning, where progress is being made, and yet that progress is almost always so much less than the really almost transformational level that it has to increase at to do it. So it's a good news, bad news story every day almost, where it's here's progress, but the other story is nothing like what is needed. And that is across the board with electric vehicles and the whole thing. How do you think about that as a challenge of what you decide to write about every day and how you approach it? Is it a good news story that progress is being made, or is it still this is not nearly enough to get us where we need to go story?
So even as we're moving ahead, we're falling behind.
I do think that we are capable of holding both things in our heads. I think that is exactly the moment that we are in. And it's really imperative for us as journalists to be reminding our audience that both things are true. But also, like, you know, as just citizens, to keep in mind other moments in history, right? I mean, the struggle for gender equality has always also been a story of rapid change, much more needs to be done, and pushback, right? The struggle for racial equality in this country, it has constantly been that story of, you know, progress and pushback, of vested interests, you know, not wanting to go at that speed. So I think it's important to keep in mind that while this is, okay, it's a sui generis issue, global issue, climate change, it can also be analogous to other moments of great social change.
Okay, one more question, right in the back there. Yeah. Get the microphone, because this is being...
I want to thank you for your time and your work on this issue. I work in state energy policy here in New York, and most of the elected officials we speak with, even on the left, say we need to do something, but, and there's a million excuses, then 2 years down the road, nothing's gotten done. So what type of stories do you think resonate most with elected officials who are the ones tasked with putting this policy into place?
Gosh, I don't know that we have.
Are there any elected officials in the room?
Maybe we can ask. Yeah, we can ask them. That's a tricky one. I mean, the literal answer is it's impossible to know. We just don't know. You know, there's no way for us to measure how many elected officials are clicking on a link, right? So then, I mean, then all we can do is speculate. I mean, elected officials are humans too, you know, and respond presumably to, you know, to stories as a human being that they read in the newspaper. But they also have a job, and I suppose that you know, they have any number of constraints on how they make their decisions. I don't really have a good answer for that, because I mean, I guess I don't think of my audience necessarily segmented with quite that granularity.
I mean, you guys just put the stuff out there. Whether it's soluble in certain social groups is really not your concern. You want to do it as well as you can. But well, listen. Thank you all for coming, and thank our three guests. I mean, this is really a big challenge, and we haven't solved it here tonight, but it's nice to know we have some soldiers of the Lord here writing about it for us. So thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming.
Send us ideas.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.